Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles.
One of the problems, he talks about victims, and he deals with it in a theoretical sense and I think in the end realizes it's a complex thing too. A lot of the stuff he's dealing with here are very complicated because they're multifaceted. But the whole notion of people, Holocaust survivors, for example, when they can come through the Holocaust with so many different results in terms of how they respond to the world around them. You've got people who come through the Holocaust and their faith in God is stronger. You've got people who come through the Holocaust and they become atheists, and everything in between. I mean, I had people in shul who came to shul all the time. You ask them if you believe in God. No. Why do you come to shul? Because I'm Jewish. So nothing to do with God, it's affirming their Jewish identity. So that's just an example. But in terms of how do they deal with the outside, with the world beyond the Jewish community, and you can't blame them if they have hatred, right, in their soul. There are people, on the other hand, there are people who say, I don't want this to happen, what happened to me, to happen to anybody else. And they really come involved in all kinds of movements, efforts, organizations that deal with the antithesis of the Holocaust, opening doors of relationship and love, so to speak, to you love, all right? It's very complex. And, I give him credit for even trying to deal with it. But, that's something, and it's still with us because we still have survivors. And the question is how is that transmitted from the survivor to their family? Okay. Anybody have a concrete answer to that?
I'm the child. My parents would never call themselves survivors. They were refugees because they didn't have a camp experience.
Yes.
Neither of them grew up particularly religious. Neither of them, I believe, believed in God. But it was essential to them to belong to a synagogue when they moved to suburbia because they believed in Jewish peoplehood.
Right.
And they were very strong Zionists. And I became, I got involved in the synagogue youth group. I was the most religious one in my family. And, that's not saying much. So, considering how often I show up in shul. But that was how they identified.
Right. Did they express any opinions about what the world out beyond the Jewish community, how they felt about that?
Oh yeah, they were involved even in the town. Even my father had to create a Cub Scout pack.
Really?
Because in Austria, he was more of a Boy Scout than he was a Jew. That was his passion. Uh-huh. And when they moved to the town we lived in, the Cub Scout pack was in the Methodist Church, so he tried to enroll my older brother, and he wasn't welcome. So my father had to create a pack with some other men for Jews.
Uh-huh.
But my mother was involved in garden club, and we were involved in civic things. So no, they believed in interaction with the non-Jewish community. But like I said, they didn't have a camp experience, so they weren't as hostile.
Right. But even though they're being Jewish at one point, pushed back against them. That was, in spite of that, that's very interesting. In spite of that, they maintained relationships elsewhere. Kol hakavod. All right, that's very important.
And I was student government president in junior high, and I got the DAR Good Citizenship Award, which shocked everybody. So the town was pretty pluralistic.
Yes.
In fact, we even had a human relations commission when I was in high school.
So let me talk about somebody it's very interesting, similar, specifically on this point. So the Rebbetzin at the synagogue in Palos Verdes, Eve Wexberg, Aleha HaShalom, lived to be 101.
Oh.
She lived through as a young adolescent, aware of what was going on through she left, her family got out right after Kristallnacht, okay? Because her father had left before that and made arrangements. And they knew certain key people in town, and she lived in Leipzig, okay? And they knew people there, and they helped them. So they were lucky. And she got out, but she witnessed Kristallnacht, and she witnessed the slow closing in on the Jews process that Hitler began, in I don't know, in 30, well, he began it in 33, but his brown shirts were around killing people even before that. So she saw all of that stuff and came to America, married a rabbi, and her husband, also Alav Shalom, was the first rabbi of Ner Tamid in South Bay. Okay, I knew Eve Wexberg from the University of Judaism days because she was very active in University Women and in the National Women's League of the conservative movement, the sisterhoods, and she was active in the sisterhood in her shul. And she was a very powerful person and diminutive. Anyhow, she opened up a line of communication to the community in Leipzig in her 80s and drew and built on that to the point where in her 90s, half blind, she flew to Germany and she was involved with these people who were creating a Holocaust memorial culture in Leipzig. And it's amazing. And the whole point was her Holocaust experience for her said, I got to fix it. Doesn't happen again at the core. It's amazing. So, the spectrum on this thing is so broad. It's difficult to pinpoint. Okay. All right. So first Bobby and then Marion.
I just want to share one word about Leipzig. And, for those of you who've been to the Holocaust Museum LA, or it used to be Laymoth, like Rachel and I are docents there. The piano we have there is from the Bluthner Company, which is in Leipzig. And it was the largest piano company in Germany. And the reason we have it is that family was religious Lutherans. And if they had sold a piano to Jews who then had to flee, they often, at their own expense, packed those pianos and sent them to the people wherever they moved to, wow, including the piano we have, which belonged to the music director of Sinai Temple way back when. Wow. I think he ended up living in San Pedro and donated that piano. Wow. But maybe there was something in the Archdiocese of Leipzig that was more tolerant. Who knows?
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you.
Although they were Lutheran, so maybe the Lutheran church there, the family.
Yeah, it's interesting because they now know. Recent research has indicated that Lutheranism did have a role to play in the Holocaust. They did studies, and they found that in communities that were largely Lutheran, the support for Hitler in the 93 election was twice as strong as in other communities.
Wow.
So the fact that they had, it may have been that it's hard to know, right, from where we're sitting right
now. My focus when I do tours tends to be on the side of featuring people who went out of their way to do good.
Yes, good.
Because I want kids to go home. I always conclude my tours by saying, if the kids leave with nothing else from their experience there, I want them to leave with the idea that one person can make a difference.
Good for you. That's great. That's important. Very good. All right, Marion.
Bobby, that's amazing. I love that. I love that. Of course, I'm a musician. But the other thing I will say is that I kind of hate to bring this. The other perspective now, my parents were Eastern European. They came in, from the pogroms. And what I noticed about my mother, I was born in 1949, so I was born after the Holocaust. And what I noticed about my mother was that her level of fear was huge. She feared people who were non-Jewish. They did not move to Great Neck because there were Jews there, though, which was interesting. They moved there because of the education, because of the schools, right? And then they got there and realized, oh my God, the whole community is Jewish. Ugh. Not so sure about this, but the education was good, and that's what they moved there for. And but my mother's level of fear was definitely ground into me in different kinds of ways. To fear the other people, to fear people of different races, religions. You can't trust anybody except another Jew. And that's it. And so it's really fascinating. I'm really glad you all brought this up now, because I'm looking at some of my own deep issues at the moment and where my fear might come from. And it's fascinating to think that there were very few Holocaust survivors in our neighborhood. Most of them were or parents, my friends whose parents were very few. Most of them were from the pogroms and were second generation like me.
Right, yeah.
So it's a real different experience to be second generation versus first generation. And that's another thing I just wanted to get a little tilt in this. But for me, the fear factor and the non-trust thing, and my dad, by the way, was totally the opposite. He was totally interracial. He was totally into whatever. He got in trouble because he had his arm around Julian Bond in some picture. Everybody went bananas. You can't do that. So it's really fascinating how they ended up together. And so I got both pieces of that. You trust everybody, has nothing to do, it has to do with humanity. Right. And then I got the one, you can't trust anybody. You have to really be careful.
All right. Well, good. That's interesting. Yeah. All right. Moving on. So in chapter 9, there's a very interesting discussion that it's the discussion of the donkey, right? It says in the Torah that if your enemy, if his donkey has fallen, you have to help him pick it up. Twice in different ways it says it. And that's very interesting. That's your enemy's donkey. You have to help him pick it up.
I thought that chapter was very interesting because I'd never considered how Jews treat their enemy. I mean, yeah. I knew there were laws about Jewish warfare. Yeah. But I never knew there was a whole category of how you treat your quote enemy unquote. That was new to me.
Yeah. Now this is presumably Israelite to Israelite, but right. The point is, but the concept though, it's a very challenging concept, and the whole idea being, and of course if you read it through, you see that there are different approaches to it. And one of what there seems to be a sort of not across the board, but a lot of the content that the sources that he cites, the point is you can't expect to change the other person's opinion of you unless you somehow can break through and moderate it by showing a little sign of goodness. And so by picking up the enemy's donkey, by helping him, it's not as if everything is going to be perfect afterwards, but it opens up a crack in the door so some light can come in, because it's showing that we know we've hated each other, but still your livelihood depends upon this. So I'm not going to just walk by and close my eyes to it. And it's a first step. And the argument would be, without that first step, there's no way of ameliorating the situation. If you just walk by and the guy's stuck there, because I'm not going to help him, he's my enemy. Why should I help him? So you're not solving anything. This is an effort. And then you got to see what happens. Sometimes the guy will just walk away and forget about it. And maybe you can see him under his tongue saying, sucker, with no gratitude. Or if he has any semblance of humanity in him, maybe he'll say, thank you. And something will be changed. But you don't know if you don't try. And I mean, to me, this is a very interesting expression, because It's real. It's a sort of a real life type situation. No, we don't have donkeys walking around here. But, if there's a person, you can transpose it into today's world. It's transposable. And it's a very interesting insight. And the reaction that, you get to this I was amazed by how many sources actually support the notion of what that can do. Very, very interesting. All right. So, Tybal and Bert.
The discussion, sometimes I at least often see things on a continuum, and I just wanted to make an observation about helping the enemy and the donkey, looking at that in preparation. At the same time, I've been reading about the pain in Israeli society when all that money has been set aside to pay for the legal defense of the Hamas pogrom terrorists who were captured, and how much, I don't know if anyone else has been following that, just it's been so many painful things because of the pogrom, but that's been painful at a very different level. And I was thinking of the two things in conjunction.
No, that is a real issue, and there's no question that that's one can challenge that. It's the same thing. Would you set aside a fund for Hitler? If Hitler had survived, and they wanted to raise money to defend him in court, would you give to it? I wouldn't.
Well, but this is the government. It's not giving to it. And that's part of what some of the people whose relatives were tortured and murdered are writing. I can't tolerate my tax dollars being used for this. Anyway, but to me, it's the same thing where you start with the principle of helping the enemy's donkey, helping the enemy.
Right. I think that there's you can't be naive about this, right? And you have to understand. And I talk this way with everybody. I'm not just making it up now. If a person is governed by an ideology that person believes is the word of God, and hatred is infused in that ideology, and it's the word of God, I don't know how you can break through that. And that's the point. A lot of people don't realize. It's the same thing that's why Nazism and Hamasism are very similar. Because on both sides, there is this concept of belief in the ultimate truth of what you are doing. And that belief validates anything you might do, because the other side are not human. When you have movements that basically say that, if Hamas, I don't go inside of Sinwar's head, but we know enough about him to understand that this is the guy who, the pigs and monkeys thing that you'll find in the Quran, even though in the Quran it's very circumspect, right? It's a very narrow statement of certain kinds of Jews. But the extreme imams in various Islamic communities take that as the basic definition. And the same way that our extremists on any Arab as an Amalekite whom you have to destroy. We got the same problem with our extremists, okay? But the point is, these extremists have guns and rockets, okay? But you saw what it did. And that's no different from how Hitler's trained Nazis. Why do you think the SS guys ran the camps? They did. Why did the SS guys take the lead in the final solution? Because they were indoctrinated to look upon the Jew as something other than a human being. The local citizens who joined with them sometimes failed because they weren't indoctrinated to that degree. So extreme ideology, where you believe you have the one and only truth, and that truth encapsulates hatred. It's a real difficulty there. If Hitler's donkey fell over and I knew what Hitler was about, would I help him pick up the donkey? I don't think so. In contradiction to the Torah, I mean, that's reality that exists in the world. That's a big problem. And it is the problem is that the source of it is the ultimate truth. That's the problem. And it's not rational. Reason cannot, I believe this. I mean, that's my belief. Okay. And I'm not, I mean, look, I'm not saying that, making a statement that, all Muslims believe that. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying this particular group definitely fits that category. I'm sorry if I offend anybody, but that's my reading of it, because I have been indirectly, I have colleagues in Israel. They're not dying, but I have colleagues in Israel who are getting no support from the Israeli government because they're not Orthodox. And there are modern Orthodox people in Israel who have the same problem because of the extremes of the rabbinate there. And that's obviously at a much lower level. But now, if you just translate that up to a higher level of evil, shall we say, what do you see? All right, Bert, and then I got Cheryl, Denise.
Okay, real quickly. The dehumanization that you were talking about is also relevant to what we were talking about before, which is immigrants or people who are not us. And yes, we do have that problem from the Torah in Judaism, and other people point to it and say, you see, Jews, their book says kill all the whatever, tear down, don't let any, show no mercy, show no pity. The other point I was going to raise is that Rabbi Held brings this up really with respect to Christianity, and the charge of many Christians or of other people, Christianity says love your enemy, and Judaism says hate your enemy and kill them all. And part of what he brings forth here is that it's a lot more nuanced than that. Right. That Judaism has a lot of different levels and a lot of different approaches to this, and Christianity as well, right. Which I was not, he said Christianity, it's not clear that this just means, someone, if your enemy comes in and he's going to kill you, that you let him.
I will say that one of the points that struck me that I don't think he emphasized enough is that when you look at the difference between Christian scripture and Jewish scripture, particularly the Torah, we have law codes, settled law that's laid out in the Torah from different phases of the evolution of Judaism, of Israelite religion. And there are some contradictions between those law codes on certain things. The Quran does not have, I know that I haven't read the whole thing, but they have statements by Muhammad, but it's not presented as a law code as far as I understand. All right, they're not organized. It's not settled law, and the fact is that people assume that the law codes of the Torah are rigid, right? I mean, people who don't understand what Talmud, et cetera, is all about, they assume that that's rigid, and that's what governs the Jewish lives. I say all the time, Judaism is a biblical the foundation is Bible, but the structure is not Bible. It's interpreted, and the interpretation has evolved and moved in different directions. And within that interpretation, you're right, Bert. I mean, there are people who adhere to the literal side of it, and there are others who don't, and that applies to all kinds of law. But the problem is the ignorance that most people in the world have as to what Judaism is about is they think that you open up the Bible, that's what the Jews do, right? And
and sometimes we do the same thing with the Quran.
Yes.
Because there's subsequent rulings of imams, et cetera, that modify this and that and the other. Right. But the originalists, the fundamentalists, they just go and they grab a piece of Torah and they take it wherever they want.
Right. That's the same thing with the Quran. That's what the imams do with the Quran. And I understand that. It's a big problem. It's a big problem. So, I mean, That is something that's very unfortunate. And the whole notion of the Jew being embedded into the law, that's what he's talking about, right? That concept is so, it has, in a sense, frozen in many non-Jewish circles, and even in many Jewish circles. I mean, ask a Jew. Ignorance of Judaism is rampant in the world, okay? Ask a Jew, what are the 10 Commandments? I challenge you. I'm not going to ask you guys. I don't want to embarrass anybody. But if I gave you a pencil and paper, could you write out the 10 Commandments? All right, don't answer. But the point is, you should. You should. Now, I know for a fact there have been studies, certain groups of Christians. I believe evangelicals probably know the 10 Commandments much better than Jews. I'll bet you. In terms of the full listing. They
know chapter and verse of the Bible better than Jews.
Yeah, I know. Right. Exactly. So, I mean, they know it. Catholics don't. Because the tradition in Catholicism was not to be biblical. You're supposed to listen to the priest. That's why they didn't publish Bibles till modern period. There were no Bibles. When you go into a church, there were no Bibles. Okay. So, I mean, there's the ignorance with respect to this is rampant. Okay. So I got Cheryl, Denise, and Marion.
Going back to Tyball's original point, which was about paying for legal representation for the the alleged Hamas individuals who were captured by the IDF. I think that's very different to looking after your neighbour's donkey. I think that Jews have been taught, I think it's even in the Noahide laws, that we have to set up law courts. And if you're setting up law courts, you can't have one side that's got umpteen lawyers on its side and the other side without any representation. And if you look at the trials of Nazis after World War II, they were given representation. And I completely understand why people who lost family or whose family were injured should think that this is a wholly inappropriate use of government money. But I think it has to be done just to make the whole position fair.
Yeah, I guess. I guess the question...
I don't like it.
Yeah.
But I think it's right.
But the question then becomes, though, I mean, when you deal with, if I'm not mistaken, if a soldier violates the law, the rules of the army, they don't go before a public court; they go before a military court.
Yes.
And I don't know what the rules are about, prisoners of war. Do they?
Well, I suppose it depends on whether or not they are considered members of an.
Well, if they are, I mean, if you're talking about people who came into Israel and were fighting and killing, then they are part of an army.
I think there's a specific legal definition of an army, but
I don't know. I mean, because they were trained and armed and taught how to do these things, right? And they are under the control of the Hamas military wing, which is an entity, and they're the ones that manage all that stuff. That I mean, unless somebody can tell me otherwise, to me that sounds like an army. So therefore, a soldier from another army, would they be brought before a civil court, or would they be before military?
I think actually, if they are not members of a recognized army, they go before a criminal court in the country in which they were captured. If they are members of an army, then they should go in front of the War Crimes Tribunal, which I wouldn't recommend because it takes forever and they're not very helpful.
Yeah, no, but I wouldn't say. I would say though the army, the government that captured them, All right. That's what we're talking about, right?
Yes.
The government that captured them, I don't know. I'm asking. And then maybe we should just conclude this discussion because we don't know the technicalities. Do they have a right to have a military trial of these people as opposed to a civil trial? That's the point. Now, and I don't know, military trials, I assume, have regulations with respect to defense attorneys or people to defend them.
Military trials tend to be the army of the country in question trying its own people.
Yeah, I understand.
Geneva Convention, probably.
Yeah. But I just think that however much I find it repugnant that the members of Hamas should get legal aid, which is in effect what this is, I think it's necessary. And I think also if they didn't get legal aid, the rest of the world would jump on Israel and say, why are you behaving this way?
Yeah, well, I mean, I can't, I'm not in a position to really respond. I understand what you're saying, and there is a valid argument there, but I don't know how these things are meant to be handled. So personally, I can't respond to that. But I'm glad you made the point.
I think it's just something to
Thank
think
you.
about.
It's a valid.
Something to think about. Thank you.
It's a valid.
Israel,
Thank you.
Yes.
Israel claims it doesn't do capital punishment, but these are not considered, assassination of Hamas leaders. How's that different than capital punishment, except that there's no trial?
Well, I mean,
there's targeted assassination. How's that different than capital punishment?
Well, but if it's in...
It points that terrorists are not treated the same as citizens of another country.
Wait a minute. Hold on 1 second. You're dealing with combatants in a war, and they are they are leading the army.
Yeah.
Then are they not subject to the same kind of threat? I mean, if I hate to talk this way, but if I have to blow up areas in order to kill my enemy in battle, in war, right? Because they're shooting at me and they are sending rockets at me, right? And their commanding people are present and leading them, then, I'm not going to exclude them from that.
Even more specifically, if you're targeting the leaders to avoid hurting the civilians that are surrounding them,
right,
that's even more relevant. And I'm just saying that's analogous. That's how you can treat these prisoners different, I would say, than you would treat other prisoners.
Yeah.
By the same rules.
Right. Yeah. Well, look, if
they were combatants, they are not citizens being arrested. They don't deserve the same kind of legal status and privileges as other people.
In a situation of war, leaders of the army are they not considered combatants?
Yeah, but she was talking about some of these people that were arrested. Maybe they were just, who knows? Maybe they were just looting. Maybe they were just civilians that accompanied them and looted houses.
Then that has to be clarified, obviously.
Yeah, but that's how I think they can be treated differently than other citizens would be treated.
Yeah.
But it really raises the whole issue of the courts, because the legislature, the Knesset could pass laws saying they're not entitled to the same kind of legal representation, and based on reasonableness, the Supreme Court could overrule that. And that's what all these demonstrations were about.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to get into that right now.
I didn't think you'd want to, but...
Yeah. All right. Denise.
So, a couple of things in regards to various comments that have been made. When you said about not picking up Hitler's donkey and that it might be even in contradiction to Jewish law, I thought, no, it's not in contradiction, because Jewish law also has provisions for self-preservation and self-protection and not endangering oneself and so on. So if there was only one Jewish law, that says love your neighbor and pick up his donkey and everything, then yeah. But there is many Jewish laws that we have to weigh all the time. So I don't, not like it's my job to tell the rabbi he's not violating Jewish law, but I don't think you would violate Jewish law by leading the donkey.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, when I said I would be violating that law.
Yeah. Like
doesn't say that. No. I agree. I agree with what you're saying. That's part of the issue that we're talking about. It's exactly the point. Yes.
You just gotta weigh these things. And then I feel like also, this is just kind of a thing I believe in general. Viewing people as others is not, in my view, the ultimate source. The reason I say that is, like, I was an anthropology major. Almost every human society carries that view to some extent. So, like, for instance, the Navajo Nation is called the Navajo, right? We call them the Navajo. They don't call themselves the Navajo. They call themselves Dine. What does Dine mean? People. And because on a very fundamental level, what they're saying is everyone else is not fully human. We're the standard of humanity, and everyone else is something else. So everyone else had names, Zuni and Arapaho and so on. But for themselves, they didn't have a name because they were just it. They were people. And what I observe is the thing that sends it over the edge into dangerous and destructive behavior is when people feel like they have the right to indulge any impulse for power unchecked. And I think unchecked power is the one common denominator. It's not about isms. It's not about this religion or that religion or this ideology or that political party or this era in history. The common thing that you see across time and space is unchecked power. And I think that that's what we really need to all rail against. That concludes my rant for the day.
Right. Well, I think that, I hadn't thought about that, so I'm not going to be able to give you a very, comprehensive response. But I think that we're sort of saying the same thing, because if the question is power, are we speaking about the power of an ideology? Or are we speaking about physical power? Because
I'm speaking about both physical power and the power to impose your views on others, the power to control other people, the power to restrict them, to ban them, any kind. When the power becomes unchecked is where you see bad things happening everywhere on earth, every single time.
Right. Well, that's correct. I think there's truth in that. I don't think anybody can argue that. That's right. And that's part of the
and I think it comes from, we don't see it so much in Judaism because we haven't really had a lot of power for the most part.
No, you're right.
But you see it in every religion that's had any kind of power. You see it in every political system, whether it's socialism, democracies, communism, royalty, it doesn't matter, theocracies, they all do it. And you see it in individuals too. It's unchecked power is the problem.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. I think that's a good, yes, that's a good point. Yeah, I agree with you. Yep. All right, Marion, I think we're going to have to end soon, but go ahead, Marion.
Okay, I'll try and make it brief. Denise, I really love that. That's really great. Everybody's comments have been really spectacular. I wrote in the chat, that you can only break through one person at a time. You never know what will break through at what time, or whether it will plant a seed for later. And you never know when a small act of kindness will have a huge impact. And that, to me, is a huge piece of this.
Yeah.
We don't know. You maybe if you helped Hitler back on his donkey and looked him in the eye, we don't know what impact that would have had. I don't know. I'm just saying. Because the other thing I will say is, again, Pittsburgh, I'm going to bring it up. I was staying over people's houses who were not Jewish on the weekends. I was going to their homes. And I always went to church with them because I wanted to be a good guest, and I was curious. This was my big chance. So one time I went to a friend of mine's Catholic church. She Italian Catholic. Mom spoke no English. She was first generation, and very loving family. They gave me a little doily to put on my head, and I went in. And at one point, the priest said something about Jews killing Jesus. And I just, I knew that this was possible. I didn't say a word. When I got out of there, their mother, through their daughter, said, because I was sitting there, she never realized what it was they were really saying. And there's no way I could be responsible for killing Jesus. And it opened her, because I was just sitting there and in that space, it opened up her eyes to this dogmatism that had been spread that she had no idea was what it really meant. Yes. Until this person who she knew was Jewish was sitting next to her in church. And so we never know. One little thing starts one little quote unquote earthquake, which starts some ball rolling, which can shift people. And the other thing I just want to say about this real quickly is, there are all these organizations in Israel of people whose families, children have been killed by the other side, who come together in peace, combatants for peace. There's all kinds of organizations, people who are willing to forgive, they're willing to give as before, but they're not, they're still hurting. And they know that the only way to not keep the hurt going is to change that and to talk to people who are on the other, quote unquote, other side. And it's to me, that's the faith that I have in what's going to happen in the future, that this power that Denise was talking about will not bamboozle everybody into a certain way of thinking, that people will come to the realization that even though they seem like monsters, there's something in there that if we can get to that little piece, we can make a difference in how some of these things shift. And we can only hope. I mean, obviously we have to defend Israel and all that, but we can only hope that somebody will come to their senses and be able to, or some people will come to their senses enough.
I think it's a good point. I think one of the problems is that there have been not many, but there have been instances when an attempt to operate that way actually backfired. And,
absolutely.
I'm thinking about
and you have to take that chance, though. Yeah, that's the thing I'm saying, is you have to take that chance and have the faith. Take the chance, because if somebody doesn't take the chance, you'll never know.
Most of the victims in the Gaza envelope were people who believed just that.
Yeah, I was going to say that, and that wasn't that's one element of it. I mean, I'm not denying what you say, because there is truth in that, okay? But you got to be very careful to evaluate the situation in which it operates. When, Hitler wanted to expand, his empire. So he first took over Austria, and that was with the support of the Austrian government, because they've always been, culturally and linguistically linked to Germany. So nobody said anything.
Not the government, but the people. The government was about to have an election to have independence, and that's what was eliminated.
All right, well, whatever. But the point is, they voted not to do it, right?
They did. The vote didn't occur because the Nazis invaded before that, and that's exactly what the Jews had to scrape off the streets. The things that the Jews were scraping with toothbrushes were written on the streets for free Austria, independent Austria. That's what the Nazis forced the Jews to erase.
I see. Okay. Well, thank you. I didn't know that. Okay. But the point is, though, basically, you corrected my technical understanding of it, but the end result was the same, right? All right. But the next issue, of course, was with Czechoslovakia. And there, of course, the argument was there were a lot of Germans, so therefore we had some rights there. And by the way, it's the same argument with regard to Poland, too. So, I mean, but nobody took them, they said, well, maybe if the Western powers said, well, maybe if we just let him, let's take him at his word, which of course he didn't live by, right? And he used these as jumping points and kept going and going. And finally, you know what happened. And the point is that to me, I'll just, again, that's the same thing with Putin in Ukraine. I mean, he wants to rebuild his whole, the Soviet empire. And if you give him Ukraine, who knows what's next? And so in a certain respect, certain kinds of people take these gestures of goodness and understanding, right? And say, okay, fine, let's work together without recognizing the true essence of the person they're dealing with. Winston Churchill, it seems to me, was one of the few voices in the world at that time who really understood Hitler. And I mean, that's part of the problem. And I think that I'm not denying. I think what you said, Marion, is a valid observation. And the point is, the people with whom you were sitting and who saw that, it goes back to what Denise said about power. If they had power to be able to on the spot get up and say, then we have to stop teaching the bad stuff about the Jews, right? And could really push that through, that would have been different. But on the point,
yeah, but they didn't do it right then. But apparently, they talked to their neighbors and their friends.
Okay, good
because
for them.
That's a whole other thing. Because
right.
You can't. That's a whole other thing. Getting up and defying somebody, actually, that makes you look like a radical. So what they did in the middle is they talked to people and they shifted people.
Right.
And my friend told me later that a lot of their friends started to question this.
Right.
So it's like that's all you can do is plant seeds. Is what I'm saying. But I agree with you. I mean, you got to know to whom you stand, know in front of who you stand.
Exactly.
Right.
You got to know who the gardener is. If I may.
And I think we Jews assume that the concept that B'Tselem Elohim is a universal concept. And it is universal to Christianity and Judaism, and it is not part of Islam. And we have to remember that.
But in Christianity, it didn't make much difference because there were good Christians who didn't include us in that.
Not all Christians are good Christians.
It is part of Sufism. So we can't say, have to be really careful.
But not of Islam in general.
Well, I'm just saying, here we go again. We're generalizing, and I think that it's really important to take people as individuals. Because we don't really know. We really don't have any idea. Anyway, that's it. I'm done with my soapbox.
Rachel, final observation.
Just to comment on the change in Catholicism. That was one of the big breakthroughs of Vatican II,
yes.
Which I think was in 1960 or 1962. That the Vatican Council, under Pope John, I think the 23rd,
yes,
was formally ended the teaching that it was the Jews who had crucified Jesus,
right.
And my personal story on that is when I was very young and we lived in San Diego, which at the time had a very tiny Jewish community. My dad used to tutor the Catholic kid next door in math and science. This Catholic kid next door was brilliant, and my dad loved doing the work. But until Vatican II, this kid was learning in catechism that Mr. Rubin was going to hell.
Yeah.
And after Vatican II, that teaching stopped and was addressed to the extent of, we don't believe that anymore, that the Catholics don't believe that anymore. And it's not like we had really good relations with this other family. That didn't change. But what Marion was referring to about Catholics questioning that ended up changing the whole culture of the church.
Yes, you're right.
That was my 2 cents.
But I think it's a good observation. But remember, the point is, getting back to the power factor, the Pope has power. And so in that instance, the papacy used its power for something that I think most people in the world would say for a positive humanitarian act, right? The power. The same thing. The papacy, the Catholic Church did not have an ambassador to Israel until Pope John Paul came along, and because of his personal relationship with a Jew, opened up relations with Israel for the first time. And that was again
one person who made a difference.
Yes, but I'm going to combine.
I mean the Jew who was a friend to the Pope is the one who made a difference.
Yeah, his work. Yes, correct, and that is correct. But the Jew in this case with John Paul understood that he had to go to the guy with power and see if he could activate the power. So it goes back to the power factor. Power can be used for good. Power can be used for evil, and that is it's a reality. It's fact. It's a good point. I mean, in this whole discussion to keep in mind. And I can tell you personally that I experienced both sides of that, because soon after that happened. Well, no, I mean, I got involved maybe 10 years later. I became involved with the rabbi priest dialogue here in Southern California. Now, I'm not going to go into the details, but the openness and the willingness to understand and to work together to shape ideas where there was commonality while recognizing differences, it even ended up being published. And one of the things that we were able to do was to get the church to agree to different verses from the Bible to be used in advance of Easter to get the Christians to start to recognize their sinfulness, because the ones that they were using up until then clearly pointed to the sinfulness of the Jews. And it reinforced the image of the sinfulness of the Jews, even though the purpose was really to get the Christians to consider their own sinfulness. What happened was the dialogue created new texts, a listing of new texts to be used instead of that, and the Pope agreed, and it had the gushbanka, it had the imprimatur of the Catholic Church. I don't know how many used it, but the point is that was done. On the other hand, we couldn't talk about Israel because the papacy had yet to recognize the state of Israel. So I saw both sides of it. But the fact is, yes, I mean, the power that people can do for good does exist. It does. And we can hope that we can find ways of getting the power, for making sure that the people who promote the power of good are able to have enough power to overwhelm the power of evil. I mean, and that's the challenge. That's the challenge. And again, you have to have a certain consensus as to what the power of good is. Okay? And that's part of the problem I think we're facing in the world right now, is what is good. And that's another subject. All right. Wow. Okay. Next week, chapters 10 and 11.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.